there are some names that you should know, but you probably know them already. I mean, one name you should know is Bruce Chapman, because without Bruce, this event wouldn't have really happened, in the sense that Bruce and Jan Wright found the portrait that you will see, and I'll be trying to work Dorian Gray quite managed yet, but you'll see that. And they basically copied it and brought it to the Research School of Economics and asked the directors of the Research School of Economics, which worked with Kieran Maher for a short time, William Coleman, would they be interested in hanging this portrait at RSC? And they all said yes. And then we were lucky and fortunate to recruit Ravi Turkey, who's here somewhere. Here's Ravi. And then Ravi's the new director, and Ravi really ran with it and said, you know, we're going to hang this portrait. Who can I get to help, who loves a party and loves to be on stage and warm crowds up? And that was me. So, thank you all for coming. I'm just going to do a little bit of background, just very quickly, because I think this is rather neat. And that building over there is called the Heinz Art. Heinz Art was rounded up in Britain, interned, because he was German, and sent to Canada, and came to Australia after coming back from Canada to the UK, and became one of the first professors on this side of the campus. Professor Gruen, whose portrait we're about to look at later on, was rounded up at roughly the same time. Younger than Heinz, put on a ship called the Dunera, and sent to Australia, and sent out to get paid. So that's two connections. And thirdly, in the audience, someone got Frank Castles, who was a professor of political science here for quite a while, and his father also rounded up and sent him. And many, many others, including the famous architect. I used to live in a house at Harry Siders. I think Harry was rounded up. So, one of the things we're doing tonight, in a way, I guess, is thinking about how weird and wonderful, you know, economics of the world is, that you can take people from Germany, basically treat them not quite as criminals, but still sort of odd, send them to places in ships, sounds like a convict story, bring them back, and come to England. So Amy's always done very, very well at this. Heinz, I'm not going to talk about, but Heinz was a professor for a long, long time and made a big impact on public policy and so on, and economics, mainly outside of Australia, in Indonesia. Go to Indonesia, everybody knows Heinz. You go around the Australian public service, everybody knows Fred. Because Fred was the same sort of person, wanting to be involved in public policy, and to go back and forwards between economics at the university and economics in the public sphere. And I think that's a really special thing at ANU. We really should pursue, and we do and so that's why some people like me, when they come here, basically refuse to leave. Hang on to the last possible moment, which is getting closer and closer and closer. The other thing that's interesting is that the connections between ANU and the public service and the community doesn't only occur at the top, it also occurs amongst young people. So the two Gruen kids, for example, when they were young, have PhDs and so on. And hopefully some of the Gruen grandchildren will get, or maybe they're going to have PhDs from here, two lovely PhDs. So it all sort of goes down. You were a student, I think, you were an honours student. So the connections are great. And so I sort of think of this place as a family, and if you can't remember my name, I do answer to Granddad. So let me begin by giving the Vice Chancellor to open the event.
thank you, Bob. Let me begin by what is traditional at ANU, by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australian Aboriginal traditional lands we meet and paying our respects to the elders of the Dunera people, past and present. I would normally begin by acknowledging all the dignitaries that are here this evening, but the list is so long, I'm going to hopefully be excused by that. Just mention a couple of people in particular. In a few moments, Dr. Martin Parkinson will in fact assist in unveiling the portrait, and as I just joked to Martin, I imagine he's got just a little bit on his plate at the present time, so we're very, very lucky to have him here this evening. Obviously, I'd also like to acknowledge David and Nicholas Gruen, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and indeed all the dignitaries that are here this evening. I think the turnout that we have here speaks volumes of Fred Gruen and the respect in which he's held. And tonight we're here to pay tribute to Fred Gruen, one of the country's most influential economists and an academic giant. And we were privileged here at ANU to have him as one of our own for many years. Fred, as we know, helped shape economic policy over several decades, informing governments and the public on important economic policy matters. Work that is continued by his sons, David and Nicholas. Thanks to David, Nicholas and the Gruen family, the Gruen Endowment has allowed ANU to continue the nation-building work that Fred undertook. And so it's with really great enthusiasm, and I think all of us are here this evening, I certainly am, and indeed to be joined by the Gruen family to acknowledge and celebrate Fred's incredible work. So, MC, in keeping with your dictates, I'm going to be short, so that really finishes the very short welcome. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over to another ANU institution, in Bruce Chapman, who worked closely with Fred and rediscovered the portrait that we're going to unveil this evening. Bruce Chapman.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and thank you all for coming. I hope and expect this to be a wonderful occasion, and the proceedings will be a symbol of our affection and gratitude for the contribution of Fred Gruen, our wonderful, charismatic leader and our friend. He was an integral part of our community for more than 25 years, but there will be a touch of melancholy here as well. My name is Bruce Chapman. I was appointed to the Centre for Economic Policy Research, which Fred Gruen started, and that was I was appointed in 1984. He was a wonderful boss, a terrific mentor, somebody that I always wanted to be like, but I won't make it. Let me explain what we're doing here tonight. In the year 2001, one of my dearest colleagues in economics, Professor Peter Kenyon, and I initiated a special issue of the Australian Journal of Labour Economics, and it was in honour of Fred, who had died in 1997. Fred was Peter's mentor, and he was his teacher as well at Monash University. Peter was very impressed with Fred's approach to economics, which was to rely on the power of theory, but always to take great account of the politics and the institutions, and importantly the data. Peter was also very impressed with Fred's elegance, and more of that later. So we commissioned some of the best labour economists, in my view, to write on areas dear to Fred's heart: unemployment, social security, welfare policy. When the journal was ready in 2002, I called up Nick Gruen to find a date that he and David and Anne Gruen might be able to attend. During the phone call, Nick asked me, "Have you heard about the portrait?" To which I said, "Having not heard about the portrait, what portrait?" It turned out that Fred had his portrait painted by a now famous sculptor, Erwin Fabian, and was in the internment camp which housed, let me use a different word, imprisoned the aliens from England that had been rounded up and sent out in 1940 on the Dunera. What was Fred doing on the Dunera? I hear you cry. Well, at about the age of 15 or so, Fred's parents sent him to boarding school in England. There are two versions of why this happened. One is very sympathetic. It is that there was a concern about the rise of Nazism and being Jewish, that Fred's life could have been threatened. The other, less sympathetic view was that he was doing really badly at school. He found it completely dull, and all he wanted to do was ice skating. whatever version you accept doesn't really matter. But Fred found himself going to a boarding school in England, a country that he knew almost nothing about, and he did not speak any English at all. When he was picked up by a teacher from the boarding school, Fred didn't know how to communicate with him, so he addressed him in Latin. The teacher turned out to be the gym instructor, whose classics training was somewhat empty. When World War II was declared, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued instructions, that is, to the aliens, people, just about all young men, just about all young Jewish men who were connected some way to Germany or Austria, that they should be taken and put into a ship and taken abroad, almost like the convicts were, in fact exactly like the convicts were 200 years or 180 years before. So Fred was on the Dunera, and it left Liverpool in May 1940. They didn't know where they were going. So somebody said, I think we're going to Dover. Well, after about 2 weeks on the high seas, it became somewhat clear that they were not going to Dover, so the next guess was Canada. But every day it got warmer and warmer and warmer. And then they decided that they must be heading towards the equator. They docked in Sydney in September 1940, and they went to Hay, New South Wales, to an internment camp. There, Erwin Fabian painted his portrait, and it ended up in the archives of the National Portrait Gallery. So in thinking about the launch of the journal, Peter Kenyon and I decided that it would be a great idea to have the portrait there, and the National Portrait Gallery agreed to that. Then I thought, and Peter agreed, wouldn't it be a really good idea to have the artist as well? Well, we didn't know if he was alive or where he lived. Australia, perhaps, maybe. Alive, perhaps we weren't sure. Nick thought he might live in Melbourne, so I went to the Melbourne White Pages and looked up the name Fabian. There were 6 E. Fabians, and one of them was at an address which was something like 42A Penrose Street, Fitzroy, and I thought, sleuth likely, that could be a studio. I've watched a lot of Get Smart in my misspent youth as a teenager, and it had rubbed off a bit, so I rang, and there was a soft, mature, croaky male voice which said, strikingly, hello. And I asked him, was Erwin Fabian, and he replied, yes, I am. I thought, yes. Thank you, Maxwell Smart. I asked if he remembered Fred Gruen, and he said, oh yes, I painted his portrait at the Hay internment camp, but I don't know where the painting is. And I said, well, Mr. Fabian, we know where it is. As someone given to melodrama, I said something like, your long, arduous, strenuous, demanding and frustrating search for the Fred Gruen portrait has ended today, Erwin. All is resolved, sorted, settled. You can rest in the quiet serenity of mission accomplished. Your pain is over, Mr. Fabian. The portrait is with us. It is home. We can be at peace. Something like that. And Erwin said, well, actually, I haven't been looking for it. I said to Erwin, would you like to come to the launch? And he said, oh no, I couldn't afford to. And I said, I've got a great idea, we'll pay you way. And he said, oh, but when I come there, I don't know anything about Canberra and I can't pay for the taxis. I said, I'll pick you up. And I did. I met him at the airport. He was a committed man. He's 87 years old. He had very clean, long white hair flowing to his shoulders. I dropped him to the hotel and took him later to the launch. When Annie Gruen arrived, she looked at the painting, which she had never seen before, and said, oh my God, it is Fred. Because she must have met Fred not that long after that. So we all went out to dinner and we had an extremely lovely time. And this is the melancholy bit. About 3 years ago, Peter called me and told me he had cancer, but he said that the prognosis was good. And he had a new project for us. He said that portrait of Fred belongs at the ANU. I agreed, of course, but not much was done about it. And nearly a year later, I spoke to Peter at length by phone, and he asked about the portrait. I promised again to try and secure the ANU and told him I would come and visit him in Perth in mid-February 2012. I did go to Perth then, but very sadly it was to his funeral. I missed him, my dear friend, by just a few days. Peter's wife, Jan Wright, reminded me of my commitment, several times, I might note. But when I contacted the National Portrait Gallery, they said the painting was too fragile, but we could make a print of it. But they would need the permission of the artists. So what did I do? Well, I went to the Melbourne phone book, white pages, and I looked up the name Fabian, E. Fabian. Now there was only one, and it was the same E. Fabian. He said, of course he'd give his permission. I asked him if he'd like to be here tonight, and he said he would. By the way, I've calculated his age. 12 years ago, he was 87. So I've added the numbers 87 and 12, and I come up with a rough estimate of 99. Erwin said he would like to come, but he phoned up last week to say, I'm sorry I can't make it, I've just got too many work commitments. He's actually opening his latest exhibition in Carlton this evening as we speak. Erwin must find the current debate about the retirement age being lifted at somewhat odd. For Erwin, he was just learning the tricks of the trade, he was just getting on top of the game. Jenny Wilkinson and David Brewer's daughter Jessica is doing a project on the family tree, and he's writing an essay about her granddad, the granddad, of course, that she never met, and Fred. So I went round to talk to her, and I found out that Dunera had been hit by a torpedo. I didn't know this before. But here's the amazing thing, it did not go off. About 1 in 50 of the torpedoes were nuts. So I'd like to express the gratitude of all of us to an unnamed torpedo checker in a German munitions factory who failed to look closely at the wires, or whatever it is you look at, to make sure torpedoes work. His or her incompetence has made a great contribution to the Australian economics profession. Not to mention the lives of the Gruens, and David, Nick, Angus, Jessica, Emma, Anna, and Alex. Not since Alexander Fleming was too disorganised and or too tired to wash all his Petri dishes in 1928 has a mistake been so valuable to the world. Jessica asked me to summarise Fred, and I said, he was just a real cool dude. That says something about my age, to use that phrase. But it was his security and his elegance that we remember with such affection, that he could drag a coat on his shoulders without his arms in the sleeves for hours, and all through animated lectures to a young Peter Kenyon at Monash. We were all amazed with this skill. Bob Gregory said once that whenever he tried to do this, the coat just fell off. Tonight we thank Fred Gruen, charismatic leader, economic policy guru, completely sensible economic advisor, communicator par excellence, a cool dude. Fred is the classic case of what the immigrant can do for the country and what the country can do for the immigrant. We thank Peter Kenyon, enthusiastic economics educator, unselfish contributor, the consummate team player, and wonderful friend. Erwin Fabian, humble, modest and understated, the wonderful artist. An unnamed torpedo checker, whose era has left us all so much better off. And I finished by thanking the National Portrait Gallery, who have made a beautiful print of the portrait and generously provided to us as a gift to the ANU. Thank you.
Bruce was head of the same economic department that Fred was head of. And we used two criteria. I was head there too. And we used two criteria. You must be a very good economist, but you've got to tell a good speech as well. Bruce is pretty good, you must admit. Now, Fred was a very calm person on the surface, and that's all I ever saw. I never saw frenetic energy, and I never saw an intellect that, like Ravi, for example, Ravi Turkey, who is the sort of intellect that starts a sentence and has 4 ideas before he comes to the end of it. This is our new director. A little bit like John Quigan, who has, I think, 3.5 ideas before he gets to the end. Well, if he sold me one, 3 of them are no good, the half of them. But Fred was very, very quiet. He has 2 boys, David and Nick. And Nick is very frenetic. Nick is very frenetic, but Nick tires me out. Because, you know, ideas just flow at an enormous rate. So here's Nick Gruen.
Thank you. Look, I stand before you as an exemplification of unintended consequences. So it's nice to have that cleared up. When Heinrich Schliemann unearthed a gold mask in Mycenae, he was reputed to have said, "I have gazed on the face of Agamemnon." In a more modest way, Erwin Fabian's magnificent portrait allows us to gaze back through time on the face of a very different person to the one we all knew. The portrait was painted just 4 months after the Dunera arrived. To find him in those days, you just followed the signs in the main street of Hay to the concentration camp. That was before Hitler had given concentration camps a rather bad name. Dad must have wondered where his mother Marianne was, how she was. She was taken to Theresienstadt, a way station to Auschwitz. It also had creepy similarities to Hay. Theresienstadt was Hitler's home for Europe's Jewish cultural elite. So as the inmates quietly starved, it doubled as a set for Nazi propaganda, showing how well the Jewish resettlement was going. As she waited to discover her fate, Marianne would sometimes have attended lectures, recitals, poetry readings and concerts, just as Dad was doing in Hay. I'll return to the person in the portrait shortly, but I thought I'd list some propositions I take from my father's success. You make your own life, but look after people. Knuckle down, work hard, get on with things, but don't be a workaholic. Take yourself seriously, but not too seriously. Don't be shy. Chat with people. If you're nice to them, they'll probably like you. Believe in, invest in your own integrity and that of others. Don't get on your high horse or start a fight unless it really matters. You'll know it really matters if, maybe only if, real injustice is done to someone who can't easily defend themselves. The best way ideas can help others is if they come with cool heads and warm hearts. Listen carefully to those who disagree with you. Listen like they might even be right. Build, don't destroy. But turn your back on things if you have to. Appreciate life. It ends. To me anyway, it's important to remember that however accomplished Dad was, I was going to deliver this speech in a far more flowing way that I have energy to. However enjoyable his company, however much Max Corden praised his scrupulousness as a scholar, describing him as a one-person royal commission was all built on the normal human difficulties and frailties. In the last month or so, we had plenty of long talks. In one, he said to me, "That's the last time I really understood you, when you punched a hole in the wall of your bedroom." That was the sort of thing I might have done at that age. Later, I decided I needed to knuckle down, work hard, and get on. The thing was, I had not punched a hole in the wall. In a move that can only be fully appreciated with some understanding of adolescent AFL fans, in the dying moment of some unspecified grand final, I'd taken a magnificent specky, descending from this ecstasy into the softness of my bed, only to learn that my jump had not defied gravity with my knee resting on some obliging opponent's back, but rather thrust through the accommodating canine of my bedroom wall. At Dad's memorial, I read a Yiddish poem from the child of Holocaust survivors. Sleep, my dear parents, but do not dream. Tomorrow your children will shed your tears. I recall years later sitting in a barber's chair and some unusual, indeed ridiculous facts came to mind. I fantasised again, not this time the unheralded adolescent superhero. I'd become a great poet, again mysteriously undiscovered. I was composing a great poem that would uncover the sublime from the ridiculous. The pity of it is, as you will appreciate, I'm no poet. I barely understand a lot of poetry. Still, sometimes a poem speaks for itself, as when I first heard this extraordinary fragment, a single sentence in 8 lines of free verse. Tossed off by John Keats in the margin of the page on which he'd been writing another longer poem. Keats was 23, desperately in love with Fanny Gruen, and he knew he was dying. This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again. And thou be conscience calm, see here it is, I hold it toward thee. What did Keats mean by this last gesture, reaching across the chasm separating the living from the dead? In any event, as the barber snipped away, tears swept down my cheek. My mind full of grief for my father, rekindled by the beauty of this poem I would never write. Self-conscious, I added to the surrealism of the occasion by managing to smile, be beatific if somewhat zoned out. The bemused barber asked if I was okay. I'm fine, I snapped back with such nonchalance that I surely convinced him, however momentarily, that the customer's usually hemorrhaged tears smiling blankly into his mirror. The poem that I never wrote might have been called 3 Moustaches, 3 Ages of Life. I expect moustaches were more important for my grandfather's generation than my father's. In any event, as a newlywed dad briefly experimented with growing a moustache. He and Mum both agreed it looked ridiculous. Unable to grow their own, Dad's young sons urged him to grow it once more. It was a long time coming. Dad agreed with Mum. Then, with David and I in our 20s on a cruise to Hong Kong, and perhaps the last time we spent in any sustained time together as a family, Dad's moustache arrived unannounced, initially unnoticed, but then unmistakable, becoming quite the full huntsman spider in the middle of his handsome face. Then, within a week or two of the end, the professor dying, that moustache crept up once again. Initially mistaken for some slip in Dad's shaving routine, but after the second day and until his death and in the coffin as he lay there, it stared back at us, as mysterious as it was unmistakable. We can only speculate about what it meant, and what he meant. I guess, like Keats, he was trying to say something across the chasm. He was saying, see, here it is, I hold it towards you. He was reminding us that no matter how much we love someone, they always remain, as life remains, a mystery. Thank you.
If you achieve fame and there's funeral or events, people always say good things about you. And by and large, you don't see or hear about the whole man. So I just want to say a little bit about Fred in that light and talk to some of the parents here. First of all, whatever you hear about Fred's judgment, Fred's common sense, Fred's contribution to economics, whatever you hear, is absolutely true. That's absolutely true. But I want to talk to you about something else for those of you who are parents, which is sort of interesting in a way. And that is that Fred wasn't very good at school. In fact, Fred did very bad at school. And when he went to England, things didn't really pick up. And so when he got to Hay, as you can imagine, with all these German Jewish intellectuals, and also given his family background, he enrolled in Melbourne University. And he did economics and did an honours degree, and he got, I think he got a 2-2. 2 2s at the end of the world. I mean, this is not normal. And then, so he goes, he goes to the army, and then he gets a job in the Department of Agriculture, New South Wales. And then he makes a couple of important decisions. One decision he makes is to take an offer at ANU, which is a research position. Another decision he makes is to go to Chicago. He didn't do that well at Chicago either, because his health was bad. So, Vice Chancellor, he didn't get a PhD. He just didn't submit. Now, he couldn't get in. You can't get a job. So I can remember when I was in the economics department, after Trevor Swan was head, and then we had Bill Phillips head for a while, we were looking for a new head. And Swan made the judgment that Fred was the man. And Fred had got himself a job at Monash with this sort of rather checkered background, really. And it was an incredible success at Monash, because all these things that people talk about, misjudgment and so on, you could really see. Organised big grants. And so I went and asked my old professor about Gruen. Because, when you get a professorship, not everybody's on your side. The professor said, well, he's not very good, because she remembered, the war period of 2 terms. And so here we are now, talking about an exceptional person who got to the very, very heights. But you could argue about how good this guy was in some sense, if you didn't have good judgment yourself, right up to his late 30s. So the reason I'm addressing this to the parents is if your kids aren't doing too well, don't give up. Jessica? This is not to you. I'm not saying to you, take it easy until you're 40, but to the parents. So the thing about Fred, when I go look around who's here, I could have put anybody on, basically, with this speech. That one was coming. Bring them up. They come. Bring up one of the bank. They come. Bring up Martin. Comes. And that's because not only do these people think highly of Fred, but they think highly of what he embodied. They like that idea of being able to go backwards and forward between universities and public service. And we like that in economics at ANU, and we're trying to do as much as that we can. Everybody can't do it. But we want to create an environment where people who can do that do well, and that's what Ravi's trying to do in part of the RSC. So Martin.
Thanks to everybody who's been involved in inviting me here for the event of unveiling Fred's portrait. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the great swath of the next generations of Gruens that are here. Nick and Anna and Alexander. I understand that Eva can't be with us tonight, with Dave and Jenny and their 3 kids, Angus, Jess and Emma. Given the long history of Gruens with ANU, the fact that Anna and Angus are already enrolled here, Alex, Emma, Jess, I think you'll be filling out your applications on the way out tonight, and I hope that economics has something to do with the choices that you make. The portrait that we're going to see is striking for Fred's youthfulness and directness. These are characteristics that defined him throughout his life. A youthful vigour and directness that could be both disarming and charming, perhaps occasionally alarming for unprepared graduate students and public servants. I have to say that I had those experiences with Fred, and I must say that these are characteristics that have been inherited by these two boys, and I have the same experiences with them. It's easy to imagine that Fred could have applied himself to any discipline and been successful, but for those of us here, we can only be grateful that he ended up being an economist, and an applied economist at that. At the time of Fred's memorial celebration in November, Peter Carmel quoted from the opening of Pagu's Welfare Economics and talked about the pursuit of fruit or the pursuit of light, meaning the pursuit of light being pure knowledge and the pursuit of fruit being the advancement of people and humanity. And I went back and reread that and thought that was just an absolutely apt description of Fred Gruen. And indeed, in his short autobiography, written in the late 80s, Fred said, quote, "I have largely been concerned with public policy and how it can lead to more desirable outcomes," unquote. And in the pursuit of that concern, he was an economist, as Bob's just said, who easily straddled the divide between academia and public policy. In the mid-60s, Fred, as part of a small interdisciplinary team of academics, gave advice on the difficult trade-offs implicit in the decision to grant equal pay to Aboriginal stock hands and stockmen in the Northern Territory. The trade-off being one that's quite striking, removing racially discriminatory laws versus employment implications for the affected individuals. He worked as an economic consultant to the Tariff Board following the 72 election, and in 73, Sir John Bunting, the then Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department, asked him to become the Economic Deputy Secretary. Instead, Fred chose to work for PMC as an economic consultant so that he could divide his time between public policy and ANU. Of this episode, Fred says, and I quote, "The Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, had asked that the department acquire an independent economic assessment role rather than relying exclusively on the Treasury for economic advice," unquote. 40 years later, the characters have changed, but the concerns have not. Fred also worked on the Assets Test Committee in the early days of the Hawke government. Now, as Nick and David know, and Bob and Bruce, Fred was generous to me, both personally and professionally. And at various times I've had the opportunity to go back and read some of the internal written briefing that he produced for Prime Minister Whitlam. And as you would expect, it's logical, direct, eloquent and influential. Indeed, the clarity of thought and structure of the argument was so impressive, so timeless even, that in a 1996 brief to the then Treasury Secretary Ted Evans, I attached a copy of a brief from Fred to Prime Minister Whitlam dated the 22nd of February 1974. And I thank David and Jason Alford for digging that out and reminding me. Ironically, given the commentary over recent years, that brief was on the desirability of publishing Treasury forecasts. Fred wrote to the Prime Minister, quote, "I have formed the impression that they," Treasury forecasts that is, "represent by far the best single quantitative assessment of likely future trends in the Australian economy," quote unquote. Given the efforts David and the team have made in recent years, I hope Fred would have reached the same conclusion today. Fred was not the only Australian economist able to cross the line between academia and public policy. We have a rich tradition of that in Australia. Think of the names: Trevor Swan, Heinz Arndt, Ross Garno, Max Corden, Nugget Coombs, Bruce Chapman, Bob Gregory, Douglas Copeland, L.F. Giblin. Many of them passed through this university, and some of them, hopefully, are still passing through. The benefit of this interchange to each of these economists is obvious. In Fred's work, progress in the discipline is often a sort of crab work between fact and theory. The economic practitioner benefits from a solid grounding in theory. The economic theoretician benefits from confronting the theory with the facts. In each of these great Australian economists, we see people capable of being theoreticians and of being practitioners, and our public policy has benefited from them. But an obvious question, an important one for all of those of you who are in academia, is do we have the next generation of academic economists who are willing and able to engage in the imperfect and frustrating world of economic policy advice? There are examples, of course. Andrew Lee's an obvious one. Bruce and Bob look like they've got years of good policy advice ahead of them yet. At the very least, they've got years of good arguments over a bottle of red wine. But as discussed with some of you when Barry Eichengreen was here last year, it feels to me like we have less engagement than we have had from the period in the 20s right through to the 1980s, and far less today in Australia than we have in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom today. So what's changed? Is it the political process is tougher on the reputations of those who get involved than it used to be? I think I can say from a personal perspective it definitely seems that way to me. Is it the way that public service operates now not conducive to those working closely with universities and academics? Is the university system not producing the right people to move between government and academia? I think these are worthwhile questions to ask ourselves. And the ANU, with its proximity to government and the public service and its proud history of influence over public policy, not just in Australia, but also in a number of other countries in Asia and the Pacific, particularly if you look to our friends in Indonesia. It's a great place to start asking those questions. Again, if I can use Fred's words, this time talking about his time in the Prime Minister's Department. Quote, like most outside observers, I'd frequently been critical of the obtuseness and folly of many government policies. It's certainly a salutary experience to be suddenly within the group of public servants whose advice is being sought and on occasions acted upon. One becomes much more aware of the many considerations ministers have to take into account. One also becomes much more careful in proffering advice if there is a possibility that it might be taken. As an aside, I think Tony Shepherd might now share. Indeed, Fred's words are both cautionary and an insight into the excitement and satisfaction of being involved in the public policy process. We can be grateful that Fred and other economists of his ilk were willing to take the risk from crossing from outside to inside the policy process. As I said, our country is better for it. And can I say from personal observation that when those same economists cross back from inside to outside the policy process, they don't seem to lose that ability to be critical of the obtuseness and folly of government policies. Again, that's for the best for our nation. But I think it's also important for the generations of public advisors, public policy advisors that they train when passing through their classes, that they have that experience. And I include those here, such as Jenny Chang up the back, who are doing PhDs in economics under the auspices of the Sir Roland Wilson Foundation, which is a genuine attempt to bring public policy and academia closer together, sponsored by the university and the Wilson family and the Australian government. Now, I know personally I benefited greatly from many hours sitting here at ANU with Fred, discussing the policy issues I was grappling with in the Treasury as a young advisor. His wisdom, acuity and willingness to invest time hopefully advanced the national interest. I know that at the very least it helped me become a better policy advisor. So once again, can I thank you all for the honour of inviting me to unveil this portrait of Fred. The Research School of Economics here at the ANU is an institution that has established a proud history in a few short decades, and Fred was an important part of that. Under the leadership of Ravi Torki, all of you are continuing to build on their reputation for scholarship and influence in public policy issues. So it is for me a huge honour and a great pleasure to be able to unveil this for you.
I'm going to do something terrible. Shut up. Could I borrow your son for a minute? Could you stand here, please? Now, you won't mind, will you? Let's think about cleaning him up a bit, all right? Let's get rid of the locks. Let's get rid of the hair. So he looks a bit neat and tidy, okay? Have you done that? Why don't you unveil the court?
I present a portrait of Alexander Gruen.
Not bad.
Not bad. It's the effect.
So you'd be pleased to hear I don't have a speech. I'm just going to wrap up and thank those people. Thank everyone. So thanks very much to Bob for running the evening, to the Vice-Chancellor Ian Young for his kind remarks, to Peter Kenyon, who can't be here obviously, and Jan Wright, and to Bruce Chapman for his hard work and yet another brilliant speech. I've heard many of Bruce's speeches and they're all worth listening to. To Nick, for those remarks. He got choked up for understandable reasons, and I'll try not to myself. To Martin for his very kind words. One person who hasn't been mentioned much tonight is our mother, who unfortunately is in the advanced stages of dementia and so couldn't be here. She's still alive and living in a home, apparently content, but not really aware of her surroundings. But obviously she was an extraordinarily important part of Fred's life. We should certainly thank the German torpedo checker. The other person who hasn't been mentioned, who we definitely should thank, is Fred Gruen, because the road to serfdom, some of you may know this story, but Fred was asked to review the road to serfdom, and he turned up at the Queensland University Library to get a copy so that he could read it. And the library assistant said that the Queensland University Library did not have a copy, but that her cousin had a copy and she could get it for him. And the Queensland University Library assistant was my mother. And had the Queensland University Library had a copy of Plato, we may have ended up like we would have ended up had the German torpedo checker been more careful. So thanks to all those. I have met and talked to many of Fred's friends who are here, who've come here. Thanks very much to all those who've come interstate. And then let me end with a final measure of Fred's influence. Both Nick and I tried very hard to have professional lives that had nothing to do with economics or public policy. I went to a lot of trouble to be a physicist, and Nick went to quite a lot of trouble to do law and history, but it was to no avail. In my mid to late 20s, I came to the realisation that my father had a much more interesting life than I was in the process of living as an expert on something that 10 other people in the world cared about. And so I went back and studied economics, and my brother did something similar, and we both ended up in economics and public policy. And you don't have to be Einstein to realise who the major influence on us making that decision was. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it interesting. All the best.
And now, one of the nice things about being an academic is you can be cheeky and not respect authority. So between us and the food and the drinks is the interim Dean Sherwood.
If ever there was a message, that was the message. Be brief. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and sharing this very special night in the life of the the colleges of the university and of the university as a whole. Thank you to our wonderful, wonderful MC for the evening, but most especially thank you to all of the Gruen family for sharing your father, your grandfather with us, and for allowing this event to go forward tonight. So please join me now with, we have drinks, we have refreshments. Please stay, enjoy, and chat with one another about this remarkable man. Thank you.